I am honored to have James Risen with me in the studio today for this hour. Investigative journalist, author. He's got a new book out, Pay Any Price, Greed, Power, and Endless War. The former New York Times reporter, or current?
Current.
Former and current New York Times reporter. There you go. You, in your new book, well, first of all, probably the thing that you're most famous for is that the Bush administration and now the Obama administration have gone after you. Right. You want to tell us that story?
Well, not really. No, I'm just kidding. It's been going on for so long. It's kind of hard to remember, where to start with it. They've been going after me for 7 years now.
Now, this goes back to your State of War, wasn't it? That book.
My book, State of War,
yeah.
Which came out in 2006, got subpoenaed as part of a criminal leak investigation based on a chapter in that book, and I first got subpoenaed by the Bush administration, and now since then by the Obama administration.
Right.
And
they basically want you to reveal your source.
Yeah, I mean, well, and I just have refused to testify in the case.
Well, that's something reporters don't do. I mean, we need to have a media shield law in this country.
Right. Yeah. There is no federal shield law.
Now, Eric Holder a couple of days ago said no reporter is going to go to jail on my watch. Is that good news that he said it, or is it bad news because he knows that he's leaving office in a few weeks?
I don't know what's going on with the government. The case is kind of up in the air right now. It's unclear what's really going to happen.
Yeah. Well, you're stirring up some activity. People are talking about it. People are waking up. I think press freedom. The Fourth Estate, the whole idea of freedom of the press. It's the only industry that's mentioned in the Constitution because it's essentially the check on government.
Right. And that's why I wrote this new book. That's my response to the government. I'm going to keep writing, keep exercising my First Amendment rights, and keep investigating the government.
We're talking with New York Times reporter, Pulitzer Prize winner, aren't you?
Yep.
Yeah, Pulitzer Prize winning author James Risen. And his new book, Pay Any Price, Greed, Power, and Endless War. Pay any price is a phrase that John Kennedy used was it his inaugural?
Yeah, in his only inaugural, in which he said, we'd pay any price to protect freedom around the world and democracy around the world. But in this war on terror, we've paid an enormous price. And I think Americans have to step back now and think about what have we gotten in 13 years of endless war.
Yeah.
13 years after 9/11, we've had roughly $4 trillion spent in the war on terror.
Mm-hmm.
We've had thousands of American lives lost in American soldiers in Iraq and Afghanistan and elsewhere. And I'm not sure what we have to show for it other than having transformed our society and created a new national security state.
Well, that $4 trillion came from somewhere and went somewhere. So it came from taxpayers by and large, and it went to this is why if you go just 10 miles north of here or south of here, wherever Virginia is, into the Virginia suburbs there, you can drive around. In fact, Tom Frank, who wrote What's the Matter with Kansas, was on my TV show, I don't know, maybe a year ago. And he had just gone down there with a video camera. And he was just documenting how there are like miles of these 20 and 30 bedroom mansions that are owned by senior executives in these defense contractors.
Yeah, that I point out in my book that I think I forget the exact 6 or 8 of the richest counties in America are now in the Washington area.
Right.
There's been a huge transfer of wealth from American taxpayers to defense, national security, intelligence, and counterterrorism contractors, and to just more generally to the defense establishment around Washington. And it's odd because, Republicans and conservatives like to talk about deficit spending and cutting the deficit, but nobody ever talks about cutting back this mammoth national security apparatus we've created since 9/11 because they're afraid of looking soft on terrorism. That's like the one sacred cow that both Democrats and Republicans observe is we don't want to look like we're soft on terror. And so as a result, all this keeps going with very little oversight.
There was just to show how absurd this can get, there was a piece of legislation back a decade or so ago, introduced into the House of Representatives, that attached some sort of draconian intrusive government measures to use against, quote, against child pornography. But it was like just way beyond the pale. It was just somebody pandering.
Right.
Bernie Sanders voted against it, as did most of the members of the House. It never passed, never went anywhere. In his last run for the House of Representatives, I was living in Vermont at the time, and in his last run for the House of Representatives, his Republican opponent ran ads saying that Bernie Sanders was in favor of child pornography.
Yeah.
I mean, and
that's the kind of ads you can run against people who vote against funding for counterterrorism programs.
This is the new child porn. This is the equivalent of it. Who dares say, "Oh no, I think we should dial back the national security state"?
Right, exactly. And it's made it very difficult to have reasoned debate in the United States today about the war on terror, and that's really why I wrote the book. I've got very frustrated with the level of and the quality of the debate we're having in this country about it. Generally, the media has just engaged in kind of has cooperated with the fear mongering, and so no one really ever steps back and says, "Wait a second, what are we doing to ourselves?" Right. I just noticed a fact today in The Intercept. The online news
Glenn
site.
Greenwald's newsletter,
and they had a story and one fact that just struck me, a very sad fact, that this young Marine who was just killed in Iraq in this new operation we now have in Iraq. Right. He's 19 years old. And he was 6 years old at the time in 9/11.
Wow.
And that just struck me as a perfect example of what we're now in. We're in an endless cycle of war.
Well, and apropos of that, or speaking to that, George Orwell wrote 1984. And, when I was in high school, I read the Cliff Notes version so I could pass the test. I didn't read the book. Right. But back about 15 years ago, I was giving a speech I was doing a tour of Australia, big cities in Australia, promoting a new book that had come out. And I found a copy of 1984 in a hotel I was staying in, and I kind of wanted these, take one, leave one places. Mm-hmm. I thought, I haven't read this book. I had to read it. I started reading it, and between that and the jet lag, I was having the wildest nightmares. I had to stop reading the book. I mean, it was so depressing. And the storyline of that book, 1984, is that there's now perpetual war.
Right.
And that's used to justify this perpetual national surveillance state.
Right.
Are we there?
Well, we've gone down that road. Hopefully, I'm still somewhat optimistic that we can find a way to turn it around. But, one of the things that Orwell points out is how useful endless war is to create a dictatorship or an authoritarian regime. And that's what happens in that book. Right. Endless war becomes useful for political purposes, for repression. And that's kind of the history, not just fiction, that's the history of empires throughout history. The Roman Empire, the British Empire, all these various empires have, once you become a global empire, you tend to have more of an elite power structure.
And you have more enemies, so you're more likely to be constantly at war. Right. James Risen is with us, Pulitzer Prize-winning New York Times reporter. His new book, Pay Any Price, Greed, Power, and Endless War.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
James Risen's book is available at all the usual suspects, your favorite bookstore, your online place, Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Powell's, whatever it may be. Check it out. Pay Any Price by James Risen. Welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you, and James Risen with us. And I just had this. This is the only book that I've written that's a comic book. But here we go. This is James Madison.
Right.
No Nation. No nation can preserve its freedom in the midst of continual warfare.
Right. That's
And-
that's the challenge we're now facing. Can we find a way to do it? And I think one of the central themes of my book is that we had after 9/11, we had this, what we thought of at the time as the Bush era counterterrorism programs. Dick Cheney and George Bush created a whole series of new operations, surveillance state, secret prisons, detention, enemy combatants, what have you. And those looked like at the time as temporary measures. And now what we see is that Barack Obama's legacy is that he's made them permanent. He's normalized the war on terror and made it bipartisan, made it much more difficult for either Democrats or Republicans to criticize because both their parties are deeply invested in it now.
I forget who the quote is attributed to. It seems like maybe it was one of the German philosophers, that power once taken is never yielded without a fight, or words to that effect.
Yeah.
And when you start a new program, it's acquiring more power, isn't it?
Right, exactly. And that's what I think Obama has shown, that executive power is very difficult to give up. Once you become the person who is in charge and it gets all the power, you don't want to be the one to give it up.
Well, and that was Madison's quote. His quote starts out by saying, war is the most pernicious of all the influences because it enhances the power of the executive, his power to grant emoluments, his power to, I forget he had a list of 3 things, and then he goes on to say, no nation in the midst of perpetual war can maintain its freedom. It is a grim possibility. What in your mind should we be doing?
Well, I think the first thing we have to do, I think the only thing that will get us out of this cycle is if the American people begin to become more skeptical about terror threats and not be so willing to get scared every time somebody says something about a new terror threat, or if the government says something. I mean, the chances of anyone being hurt in a terrorist attack are infinitesimal. And, you have much more likelihood of getting struck by lightning. And yet we have allowed our country to be transformed as a result of these more or less abstract threats. I mean, one of the best terrorism analysts I know, Brian Jenkins from RAND, told me that no one wants to admit it, but the decade since 9/11 is the safest in terms of terrorist attacks in the United States in 40 or 50 years.
Wow.
We had more terrorist attacks in the 60s and 70s.
Yeah, you had the
and
Weather
80s.
Underground, you had the right-wing groups.
Right. Than we've had since 9/11.
Abortion clinic bombings,
Right.
doctors being remarkable. James Risen with us, his new book, Pay Any Price, Greed, Power, and Endless War. We'll be right back. It's 20 minutes past the hour. Welcome back. 20 minutes past the hour. Thom Hartmann here with you, and James Risen is with us, the New York Times Pulitzer Prize-winning, New York Times best-selling, New York Times reporter and author of Cost of War. What's the first one?
State of War.
State of War. Thank you. There we go. State of War, and now his new book, Pay Any Price. In Pay Any Price, you lay out some really, really shocking revelations. For example, we shipped pallets of cash to Iraq in a way that were actually visible from outer space on surveillance satellites. They could see pallets of cash being piled up on the ground outside these trucks or outside the planes that they were taken off of. What happened to that? It's billions of dollars.
Yeah, it's really remarkable. The Bush administration took truckloads and truckloads of currency, $100 bills and pallets, out of the East Rutherford, New Jersey currency facility of the Federal Reserve Bank in New York, trucked those to Andrews Air Force Base outside Washington, then flew on C-17s, flew the cash to Baghdad International Airport, and then convoys picked up the cash at Baghdad International Airport and took it down what was then called Route Irish to the Green Zone or to the Iraqi Central Bank. And from there, nobody knows what happened to a lot of it. And they airlifted between 12 and $14 billion in $100 bills, and in many flights over a period of about a year and a half.
And this is into a country where the average annual wage was in the neighborhood of $1,000 a person.
Yeah. It was remarkable. And then once the cash arrived, there was virtually no oversight, no accounting, and a lot of it was stolen or wasted. And what I found and reported in the book is that the Stuart Bowen, the Special Inspector General for Iraq, was the only U.S. official who really cared what happened to the money. And he and his investigators tracked it to some of it, almost $2 billion, to a bunker in Lebanon, and it realized it was money. It had been stolen in Baghdad and then secretly transported and was being hidden in Lebanon.
Do we know where it is now?
Last time anybody knew, it was still in the bunker, but I'm not sure. It could have been moved.
Yeah. That's amazing. I mean, it's like we're awash. $2 billion is meaningless?
Right. Yeah, and then Bowen tried to get the U.S. or somebody to go do something about it. He found that there was no interest whatsoever.
Yeah.
By the time he found out about it, which was in the Obama administration.
Yeah. In just a few minutes ago, we were talking about James Madison's warning that no country can retain its freedom in a state of perpetual war. We were talking about George Orwell before the break. How, in your mind? Well, let me recalibrate that question. Barack Obama ran basically on a platform of I'm going to undo the damage Bush has done to this country.
Mm-hmm.
We're not going to torture people anymore. We're not going to call it the war on terror anymore. Things that more or less he followed through on, or appears to have followed through on, or says he's followed through on. Okay, you don't think he's followed through on. Tell me about this. And where should we be going? What specifically could he be doing in the next 2 years to reduce the possibility of our loss of our freedoms, basically?
Well, I think he has, as I said before, I think he's made the war on terror permanent in direct contrast to what he said he was going to do when he was running for office. And you could argue that the one thing that he has stopped is the use of torture, enhanced interrogation techniques, although in the executive orders and the policies that he's laid down, he has not banned their use permanently. He's only said we're not going to use it right now. And if you just look down the list of things that have happened or not happened, he said he was going to close Guantanamo, and he didn't. He allowed Congress to shove him around on that issue. He didn't really stand up and make it a major issue. He just caved in. He allowed. He's expanded the use of Predator drones, and he's been given by his Justice Department lawyers new powers to kill without due process American citizens through the use of Predators or airstrikes or even ground troops. And he has he's continued. The war in Iraq, which he claims credit for having ended. In fact, all he did was pull troops out by the deadline that Bush had negotiated. People don't, Republicans in particular, don't want to remember this because it's inconvenient politically. But right. George Bush, before he left office, negotiated a status of forces agreement with the Iraqi government that called for all of the U.S. troops to be pulled out of Iraq by, I think it was 2010, 2011. And all Obama did was abide by that. And so you can't credit Obama for doing anything differently on Iraq than Bush was planning to do. And so, and in fact, he actually dramatically increased troop levels in Afghanistan for no apparent objective.
Is this do you think a case of how the office captures the person?
I think that's partly true, but I also think Obama was never as liberal as people thought, particularly on national security. I think one of the little precursors, in hindsight, one of the measures that you can judge, or people should have paid more attention to, was his vote in the summer of 2008, while he was still a senator, but he was running for president, on legislation on the NSA, in which it was the Bush administration was seeking new legislation to basically endorse the NSA warrantless wiretapping program and to give them bigger power. Obama voted for it and voted for immunity for telecommunications companies, legal immunity.
Yikes. Okay, we're talking with James Risen, New York Times bestselling author, reporter for the New York Times. His new book, Pay Any Price, Greed, Power, and Endless War. We'll be back with more of my questions and your questions for James Risen right after this.
You're listening to the Thom Hartmann Program.
Welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you. James Risen in the studio with us. We're very pleased and honored to have him with us. New York Times best-selling author, New York Times reporter. His new book, Pulitzer Prize-winning reporter, his new book, Pay Any Price, Greed, Power, and Endless War. James, tell us about Dennis Montgomery.
Dennis Montgomery is really one of my favorite stories in the book, and he was a computer software expert who claimed that, among other, he claimed he had a lot of different technologies that were kind of super secret, and one of them claimed that he had the ability to detect hidden messages in videotape. And one of the things that he claimed he could do, after a long series of coincidences and connections that he made with the CIA, he convinced the CIA, or the CIA became convinced, depending on who you talk to, that that he could detect hidden numbers and letters in Al Jazeera news broadcasts, in the videotape of Al Jazeera broadcasts. And he claimed that in the banner on Al Jazeera, his technology would find these numbers and letters that were showing up.
There were secret messages to terrorists.
Yes, the CIA became convinced, and this is one of the more interesting aspects of this, is did he let them become convinced of this, or did he convince them? Or did they just want to believe this? That these numbers and letters corresponded to international flights that Al-Qaeda wanted to attack, and that these were messages to their far-flung network of agents who were going to strike and attack these international flights around the world. Mm-hmm. And the CIA became convinced that this was in 2003. They became so convinced that they told President Bush. They had a super secret source that was warning them that all these international flights were going to be attacked. And so at Christmas 2003, President Bush ordered the grounding of all these flights around the world based on Dennis Montgomery's technology.
So a lot of people had their holidays disrupted.
Yes. And I was told that there was even a discussion at the White House about shooting down some of these planes. Whoa. Based on the new authority that the Bush administration believed President Bush had to target airplanes in the air if they posed a terrorist threat. And after some of the flights that were grounded were in France, and the French government and the French intelligence service was not amused by this, and so they demanded to know from the CIA what source of information they were using to base this grounding on. And finally, the CIA told them about this technology that they were getting from Montgomery, and the French had a French high-tech firm check it out, and they realized that this was just a fabrication. And it took a while for the CIA to become convinced that this was a hoax. But eventually, once they decided this was a hoax, they covered the whole thing up and kept it secret. And Montgomery got even more contracts from other parts of the government after that.
He didn't go to jail for scamming the CIA?
No.
He took millions from them?
He got, according to the
To
CIA...
watch Al Jazeera?
Yeah. Well, he got contracts from different arms of the Pentagon, and he kept getting more contracts later for up until the early days of the Obama administration.
That's amazing. It's absolutely amazing. Let's pick up a couple of calls, if that's okay with you. Where did my cursor go? There it is. Bill in St. Helens, Oregon. You're on the air with James Risen. Bill?
Oh, Bill, I'm sorry.
Hey.
Mr. Risen, I've been following this a little bit. I'm actually just reading an article about it in The Nation as we speak. I think you should turn this around on these people. It seems to me like the CIA and the Justice Department, they're way more concerned about protecting unconstitutional criminality than they are about upholding their oath to protect and defend the Constitution. I don't think any of these people have any right to... Any of these people that have supported these illegal acts have any constitutional authority to hold you accountable in any way, shape, or form. I would make that the thrust of every argument. Why aren't you protecting the Constitution? Why are you siding with the criminality? Because that's really what they're doing.
Thoughts?
Well, I mean, that's as I said earlier. My answer to the government is that I'm still writing. I keep writing. That's what my answer to the government is. This new book. I wanted to keep uncovering and investigating abuses of power, and so my answer really is just keep digging, keep after them, stay in their face. I guess.
Yeah. And talking about the Constitution, as it were. I mean that. What you have a colleague who was over at Fox News, his name is Rosen,
right? Yeah,
who was also being looked into by the Bush administration
or the Obama
administration. Yeah. In fact, Eric Holder just came out and said that I think this morning or yesterday that naming him and co-conspirator was the thing that he wished he could have not done, undo. He regretted.
Right.
Is he in the same boat as you? Is that?
I don't know the full details of his case. He hasn't spoken out publicly much in the past, so I don't know the details. Although I just know the way the Obama administration has dealt generally with the press and with whistleblowers is, as I've said many times, they're the greatest enemy of press freedom in a generation. They've cracked down on more, they've prosecuted more of these cases than all previous administrations combined, and they keep they seem determined to try to limit national security reporting to accepted pathways. They are trying to punish reporters and stories that don't conform to the White House's accepted messaging.
Storyline, as it were. Yeah, remarkable. Jim in Chapel Hill, North Carolina, listening to WCHL. Hey, Jim. You're on the air with James Risen.
Tom. Yes, I'm enjoying the conversation very much. I find it fascinating. I wanted to just backtrack for a minute and give you a sidebar story, which is true of another example of cash being moved, and perhaps Mr. Risen may know something about this, but at 9/11, my wife and I were living in Miami, Florida, and my wife was a mid-level manager at Royal Caribbean Cruise Line. And that Saturday, a cruise was departing for 1 week to the Western Caribbean, and Lindsay said that approximately 100 members of the Bin Laden family showed up in all kinds of limousines and with absolutely hundreds of steamer trunks, not just suitcases, steamer trunks, and that they were allowed to circumvent the regular customs and Royal Caribbean check-in. They were led in by higher-ranking government officials to another part of the ship, and instead of making the entire sojourn, they conveniently got off with everything they had in the Cayman Islands 3 days later after sailing. And I would just like to believe in my own mind that there may have been a lot of cash there. And again, it had to have been orchestrated, this entire thing, by somebody very, very high up, because Royal Caribbean would not have allowed that under any other circumstances. So,
Jim, thanks for the call and thanks for the question. What
well,
happened?
I've never heard that story, but I do know it's been reported pretty widely that right after 9/11, a lot of bin Laden family members were allowed to leave the United States
Right.
by the Bush
In
administration.
fact, those were the only planes that were in the air. If my
I
understanding
can't remember
of it
all the
is correct.
details. I just remember that it's been confirmed that the Bush administration allowed a bunch of bin Laden family members to leave very hurriedly from the
Right.
United States.
Right. That's a whole sidebar story.
Yeah. Yeah.
Zachary in Bryan, Texas. You have a question for James Risen?
Yes, I have a question dealing with the money that he said earlier in the show that was trucked over to Iraq.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think that the government, our government, and the Iraqis, that they want that to go missing in order to fund the war indirectly, to keep funneling it to these terrorist groups, either giving it to them or allowing them to steal it?
Well, we don't know who exactly stole it. I can't identify that. All I know is that the Special Inspector General for Iraq realized that that very powerful Iraqis working with some clearly powerful people in Lebanon managed to steal and then move this money to Lebanon for safekeeping for their own use. We don't know who they are exactly or what they're planning to do with it exactly. But I have no evidence of any U.S. Officials' involvement with the theft.
And on that, we'll be right back in just a moment. We're talking with James Risen, New York Times Pulitzer Prize-winning, New York Times best-selling reporter, writer, author, book writer, and his new book, which is absolutely brilliant. You need to get over to your favorite place to buy books and check this thing out. Pay Any Price, Greed, Power, and Endless War by James Risen, R-I-S-E-N. Check it out.
You're listening to the Thom Hartmann Program. Visit thomhartmann.com for audio and video archives.
We'll be back with more of your questions in mind for James Risen. And welcome back. David in Ypsilanti, Michigan, watching Free Speech TV on the Dish Network. You know where Ypsilanti is, don't you?
I do.
Yeah, indeed.
Yeah. I used to live in Detroit.
Yeah, I used to live nearby. David, you're on the air with James Risen.
Hello. Yes,
Hello.
I don't want to sound like some conspiracy guy. I would like to know if you guys know who funded ISIS, because I know the United States formed Al Qaeda to fight the Russians in Afghanistan. My whole family thinks I'm nuts because of this, but I mean, it's documented. You can watch Hillary Clinton, addressing Congress about it. But who really formed it? Is it Saudi Arabia or was it, America? Who formed this ISIS group?
David, thank you for the call. Your thoughts on that?
Well, I think it's a complicated answer. ISIS is really a symptom of the dysfunction and the chaos in Iraq that we left behind, or that we created with our invasion in 2003. What we did essentially was, when we invaded Iraq and overturned Saddam Hussein, we not only got rid of Saddam Hussein, but we essentially overturned the whole social society, the demographics of the society, because we said, okay, now it's got to be a democracy. And that meant that the majority Shia population would suddenly, for the first time in modern history, be in charge of Iraq. And the Sunnis, who had, Saddam Hussein had been a Sunni, were now a minority. And ever since our invasion, the central fight in Iraq has been between Sunnis and Shias. And the ISIS is an outgrowth of that continual civil war, sectarian war going on between Sunnis and Shia. Sunni insurgent groups throughout the Middle East in recent years have been funded probably by wealthy Arabs in countries like Saudi Arabia or the Gulf or other places. And but now ISIS has been so successful that they're generating a lot of their own money and capturing a lot of their own arms.
I'm curious what you think about Steve Clemens reporting in The Atlantic that John McCain and Lindsey Graham basically went to the Saudis and said, please fund these Sunni nationalists against al-Assad, and that became ISIS. It just ran out of control.
I don't know. I mean, I think that's probably overly simplistic. I think there's a number of groups, Sunni groups in Syria who were trying to fight Assad, and that became kind of a proxy fight between Sunni Arab countries and Iran and the Shia and the Alawites are kind of aligned with the Shia. Right. And so it's a very complex melting pot of what's happened in Syria. So I wouldn't say that ISIS is a direct result of that. I think what you had was a very messy, chaotic situation in Syria.
And a lot of the ISIS fighters, members, a lot of the leadership are ex-Iraqi military.
Yeah.
They've basically kicked out of their jobs by L. Paul Bremer, and they've been unemployed for 8-10 years, whatever it is. Anyhow, we'll be back with more of James Ricin right after this. Welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you. James Ricin in the studio with us, taking your calls and talking about his new book, Pay Any Price, Greed, Power, and Endless War. And Rick in San Antonio, Florida. Hey, Rick, what's up?
Yes, Tom, thank you for taking the call. Sure. I'm interested if either one of you have heard or have read of the Senate Intelligence Report, the pre-war intelligence to the lead up to the Iraq War. It's on the Senate.gov website. One easy way to find it is to Google phase2b.pdf to see the initial draft of the report. And there's also a response to this report. I'm interested if either one of you has read this report.
I have not.
I think if you're talking about the same thing that I think you're talking about, I think I wrote about it when it came out years ago. So.
What's the point of it, Rick?
The point of it is that there are some Bush officials, appointees, that appear to be directly involved in the activities that led up to the Iraq War, and I just wondered if you'd like to comment on that or not.
Yeah. Okay, Rick. Thank you. Apparently not.
Well, I'm not sure exactly what the question was.
Yeah. Okay. I'm not either. So. Devon in Blacksburg, Virginia. You're on the air with James Ricin.
Great. I'm looking forward to reading Pay Any Price. And I'm wondering if there's been any investigation into the alliance between the British company that Michael Chertoff is chairman of the board for, that's BAE Systems, who now helps sponsor the PBS NewsHour. BAE Systems and the U.S. Army cooperate at ammunition plants, at least 3 locations in the United States, where BAE is making a handsome profit while the U.S. Army picks up the cost of the environmental permitting and violations. I'm speaking specifically of the Radford Army ammunition plant, but there's also one in Kingston, Tennessee. BAE has a very ugly environmental record at these facilities.
Well, let's get James's thoughts on this. Devon, thank you for the call.
I don't know anything about it, but it sounds interesting. Maybe it's something I should look into.
There you go. Okay. Your spidey sense, your reporter sense goes. Kathy in Madison, Wisconsin. Hey, Kathy, thanks for listening to 92.1 FM. You're on the air with James Risen. Kathy? Kathy is listening to her radio, not her phone. Margie in Portland, Oregon. You're on the air with James Risen.
Yes. Well, Mr. Risen, it's great to be able to talk to you and listen to you. And Tom, I always love you. I'm not sure, Mr. Risen, if you can answer this, but I would like your opinion on why you think the Obama administration has been as bad, if not worse, than the Bush administration about whistleblowers and journalists after all of his talk about how they had the right to report the truth and they were needed. And now it sounds like he's even prosecuting more of them.
Right. Yeah, I think that's the $64 question in my mind about this administration. Why this is happening? I think part of it is the advances in technology make it easier for the government to conduct investigations. Another part of it is just the kind of the growth of the national security state has made it more aggressive in pressuring the White House and pressuring the Justice Department to go after reporters and whistleblowers. But I also think that after this much time and this many prosecutions, it's what Obama wants to happen. I mean, a president sets a policy and a pattern of behavior and a tone, and so I think clearly, if he didn't want this to happen, it wouldn't be happening. So I think there is something about the way he deals with the press that has led to this.
Well, and apropos of today's news, we've got Casey Hickox, this nurse who was in West Africa, who now Paul LePage is chasing around Maine. And it seems that some of these governors, Paul LePage and Chris Christie in particular, have discovered that selling fear works, and they're both up for re-election. And there's a few Democrats who are doing it too. Could it just be that that's the gestalt of the day, that Bush reacted to 9/11 in a way that was like, oh, my God, we're afraid we have to kick back, rather than saying, when the Washington Post reported that the Taliban offered to turn bin Laden, arrest him and turn him over to a third country for prosecution if Bush would simply provide some evidence, he should have said yes, and we could have done this as a police action.
Right. Yeah, and then Obama has extended that war on terror, that whole mindset. Right. And I think his approach to whistleblowers and the press is part of his larger national security policy. It's part of this effort he's done to kind of normalize the war on terror.
But in a certain sense, if that notion of the gestalt of the day, whether it's the cause, whether it was produced by George W. Bush or not, he's kind of boxed in, isn't he? I mean, if he pulls back the way that you and I would like to see him pull back, they're going to jump down his throat.
Yeah, well, I mean, that you saw that on Guantanamo away, where he signed an executive order ordering Guantanamo to be closed, and then when there were criticisms in Congress against him, he caved, and so.
Well, he didn't have any choice, did he? Didn't Congress pass a law forbidding him from using money?
I think the question really is, what about leadership? What is he going to lead on national security or not? Is he going to give in to the fears that have developed over the last few years? And I think the record now shows that he's decided not to fight on national security issues.
Which is unfortunate. It's really time to say this is the land of the free and the home of the brave. Damn it, we're brave. Right. James Risen, his new book, Pay Any Price, Greed, Power, and Endless War. Thanks so much for being with us today.
Thanks for having me.
It's an honor and a pleasure to talk.